The job market is absolutely cooked. It is pretty insane how nothing is moving, jobs aren't really real, everyone is outsourcing, and no one's really accepting it. And it's getting a bit weird. There's a small group of people, like you go on Reddit, who are like convinced the job market is cooked. And I fall into that category who feel like right now it's absolutely cooked. There's unemployment's way higher than many governments are admitting. They're saying like, oh, it's 3.5 or 4%. And actually, I think the real number is closer to 10. And then a lot of job applications, like job adverts are actually false. They're not real. They're ghost applications. But for every one person saying the job market is cooked, you'll probably talk to about nine who just say, oh, it's your CV, dude. It's your CV. Your CV just kind of sucks. Are you doing a cover letter for everyone? Are you using a CV for each specific job? Are you tailoring it to each job? Are you putting it through an ATS program? Are you using AI? Are you blah, 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 blah? Are you putting actionable items on your CV, bullet points, whatever? It's like, yeah, for every one person, there's nine people that basically will just gaslight you into thinking that you're the problem. And I think pre-COVID, you could make a pretty strong argument that if someone wasn't getting interviews or callbacks, it probably was like their experience, their CV, maybe their cover letter. Although in my experience, cover letters have never been important. But pre-COVID, I would put a job application in, and 20 minutes later, I'd get a phone call from the recruiter who was dealing with that job post, whether it was an internal recruiter or an external one, and they'd be asking to have an interview the next day, and I'd have an interview the next day, and then 2 days after that, maybe the end of the week. If I applied on Monday, I'd have an interview Tuesday, and by Friday, I'd know whether I got the job or not. And if I didn't get the job, I'd get feedback. That was pretty standard pre-COVID. Like that was quite normal. For a lot of jobs, that was very, very normal. For most jobs, that was very, very normal in the private sector. And now you can put a job application in, and you can basically bet that you're not going to hear back for at least 2 months. And when you do hear back, it'll be an automated rejection email. It's just not the odds of you hearing back less than the odds of you hearing back. We're at this point where it's just all fake. Nothing is real. It's all bullshit. And it's crazy because the stock market is super bullish, like super. We're seeing like all-time highs. I mean, over a long enough period, you always see all-time highs in the stock market, but it's just weird. Normally, when you see the job market going downhill, it means that the global economy is downhill. And maybe the global economy is in trouble. It probably is, but the stock market seemingly hasn't caught up because there's AI fever. So it's just, I don't know, it's just ridiculous. I think people are starting to see it, from what I've been seeing, it's early 2024, late 2023, the post-COVID era was when it started to slow down. And I think 2026 is kind of like, I was going to say peak, but I don't think it is the peak. I think it's going to get worse. I don't think it's going to get better. I think we're 2.5 years, 2.5, 3.5, or 2.5, 3 years into probably a 5-year rut. Generally speaking, these job downturns in the employment market usually last about 5 years, like 2008. And right now, I just don't see it getting better. I only see it getting worse. Companies are just outsourcing more people, more teams to cheaper countries. Shareholders are just taking more and more profits. Companies are making more short-sighted decisions, ignoring long-term investments, trying to protect their own investments, like commercial properties, forcing people to return to the office so they can lay people off without like having to pay them redundancies, treating their employees like crap because, well, they can. And it's also being made worse by how terrible the job hiring process is, the whole hiring process. Like I was saying before, it was super easy. You apply, talk to a recruiter, you have an interview, you find out quite quick whether you didn't get it. Now you you could be in a 7-step process. You know, you have to do a song and dance, you have to beg them for a job, you have to glaze them in the application, in your cover letter, you have to glaze them. It's just not a great experience. And then you get to the interview and then you have to like put on a fake, so like sort of fakeness about, you have to be inauthentic, you have to say all the right things, and you have to do their song and dance. You basically have to beg them for a job. And then you have to do a presentation, it's unpaid, you have to do work for them outside of work, unpaid, like a project, which 9 times out of 10 they'll use for their own work. And they're just basically just abusing you at that point. It's just abuse. Because they can just make you do whatever they want. You'll do it because you're desperate for a job, and then you'll go through 3 rounds, and then at the end of it they'll just ghost you. Because they can. They can be picky. There aren't that many jobs. There's too many people looking for work. You know, and we're just at this point where we're just at mercy. We're just completely at mercy of these huge companies. You know, if you went back 30 years ago, you know, early 90s, the 80s, maybe even the late 70s, you know, companies would compete for people. They would, you know, you could go back and look at like the advertisements in the newspapers where they'd be like, we have a great pension and you get Fridays off, or you get half a days on Fridays, and you get a crate of beer. You know, you come work at the beer factory, you get a crate of beer, you know, every week you get a crate of beer, and you'll get like, you know, we work at the bakery, we give you the leftover bread and the muffins and all this stuff. And yeah, with great defined benefits pensions, which don't exist anymore. You know, apart from a few small sectors in the public sector, there's some DB pensions. And now, you know, it's just slop. You know, you go on a job, you see a job advert, and they're like, yeah, you know what one of the perks is? Free parking. Which is crazy. I think that's actually a perk. If you actually go to like hospitals and you go look at like the staff parking for like the doctors and nurses, they actually have to pay for parking. It's the most barbaric thing ever. But you know, and now it's so ridiculous that companies will be flexing free parking. It's like, that's a prerequisite. I mean, in an actual fair and just world, you should actually be paying people to come to work. Like, you should be paying their train fares, you should be paying their bus fares, and you should be paying for their car fares, because, you know, ultimately people can exist without businesses, but businesses can't exist without people, right? And we've got this the complete wrong way around now, where we've flipped it on its head, and we've basically agreed that we're just going to beg companies to give us jobs. Please give us a job, please, a crumb of money, you know? And then you look at salaries, and it's just insane wage stagnation, you know, minimum wage creeping up, wages just staying the same pre-COVID, are basically the same. They've basically been stagnant since 2008. You know, a good example is if you looked at like bus driver salary in the UK in like 2006, 2007, they'd be on 30 something K, which was really good back then. And they'd have great pensions, great benefits, all this stuff. Now you go and you go look for a job as a bus driver, and it's like 38,000. So in 20 years, the pay's only gone up £8,000, and it's been stripped of all like the great benefits, and they don't pay as much overtime and all this stuff. So you've only had a pay rise of £8,000, which has just basically been eaten by inflation, which is another thing that no one's really talking about. Well, people are talking about, but governments aren't talking about, is the fact that the inflation numbers post-COVID and during COVID are basically completely fabricated. I mean, if you actually look at the price of things, inflation was probably between 30 and 40%, right? So effectively, since COVID, most people have had a pay cut in real terms of 30 to 40%, pretty much. So if you were to say that pre-COVID, a great salary for a role was £50,000, basically, if you were on £50,000 pre-COVID, if you're now post-COVID not on about £70,000, you're basically worse off, pretty much. You're worse off in terms of like buying power. Energy's more expensive, fuel's more expensive, and this is all just feeding into this poor job market, because as things get more expensive and people get more desperate, people will lower their standards. And because people are lowering their standards, because they have to survive, it means companies can be cheekier and cheekier and more abusive and abusive. And we're just at this level of ridiculousness now, where companies are dictating like the most ridiculous things. And just the whole process, the whole application process doesn't work. They're advertising fake jobs that don't exist to make the shareholders think that they're like hiring and the company's successful. They're using like AI and ATS scanners that are just basically just weeding out really good applicants. You've got people from abroad mass spamming applications, stealing CVs, um, and with fake qualifications or sitting exams, having other people sit exams for them so they can come over on sponsorships and such. And it's just a mess. Like the whole thing is just a massive mess. And there's really not many solutions to the problem, really. Companies don't want to fix the problem. It's not beneficial for them to fix the problem because right now they can get workers at all skill levels for basically whatever pay that they want, whatever they want to pay. They don't want to hire juniors because they don't want to train them up. So they'll just basically just keep selecting the cream of the crop for less and less money. And for the short term, for the next 5 to 10 years, it will be very beneficial for them. As a lot of the people age out of the industry or particular industries or whatever industry it is, right? And there's no youngsters to replace them, then they'll see the downsides. But what's the point? If you're going to make, billions over the next 10 years, why do you care what happens in, year 11? You don't really care because you'll be retired, But one of the problems with CEOs is they're paid so much money that they basically have no incentive to work hard or do anything good because in a single year, you've paid them enough to retire. So they have no incentive. They don't care what happens in 5 years' time to the company. There's no incentive for that. And that's another part of the problem is there's so much management bloat in companies. There's so much inflated salaries for people that functionally don't do anything within businesses. They're not adding any value. They're detracting. You see managers on 6 figures with ridiculous bonuses. They'll have 10 people under them and their goal is to make sure that all 10 of those people hate each other and fight each other for their jobs and promotions and salary bumps, and to be grateful for a 1% pay rise each year, and to work like a dog. It's within the company's benefit for that to happen. That's why managers are paid so much money. People are always like, oh, why do managers get paid so much for doing functionally nothing? Because functionally they don't do a lot, right? They don't actually do any actual individual contributions. And it's because it's better to pay one person an outrageous salary and then have them screw over 10 people than it is to pay your manager what a manager should be paid, which is less than the individual contributors. But they take on the management responsibilities, and then the individual contributors are paid more because if you did that, then overall you'd have to pay quite a lot more money to your employees. But that would be the fairest way to do it. The people that are actually contributing the most work and keeping the company actually running. I suppose it depends on your job, really, but it's just cooked. Like, it's absolutely cooked. And just nothing is really being done about it. I genuinely don't know what the solution is. I guess you just ride it out. If you have, savings, if you get laid off and you have savings, ride that out. If you can, look at starting a business, but that's not always viable for everyone. I don't know. I would say the only type of work that I'm seeing that's like really easily available is probably like super casual work, which is, super uncomfortable, think sitting in a non-air conditioned van in the middle of summer delivering heavy furniture. Or, things of that nature where basically you trade your time for value, the worst kinds of jobs, basically, where you basically wreck your body in exchange for a certain number of hours, and then the number of hours you put in is what you get out pay-wise. Those are almost always the worst kinds of jobs, with the exception of like solicitors who will charge anywhere from £300 to £900 an hour to give you the same information that an AI LLM can give you in like 30 seconds. But for most people, exchanging time for money is not great. But if you can survive on it, then maybe that's how you ride it out. But the skilled labor market is cooked, and it's actually trickling down into like retail and stuff where people are struggling to get retail jobs because people in the skilled market are struggling to find jobs, need to pay their bills. So they're like, well, I'll just go stack shelves in Tesco's. And Tesco's is turning around and saying, bro, we're not hiring. We're firing. We're not hiring. We're firing. That's the point where we're at. And what these companies don't understand is they're making these record profits, but they're laying loads of people off. So as people blow through their savings, eventually they'll get to a point where they go, well, I can't afford a holiday, so they're not going to be buying flights. So flight companies are going to struggle. And they're not going to be going abroad, so it's not going to stimulate the world economy. They're not going to be going out to eat, which is what, restaurants are struggling because restaurants have raised the prices to such a ridiculous degree that it's just uneconomical to go out to dinner. People aren't going to shops, they're not spending. We're already seeing like a downturn in like consumer spending. It's not good. So in the long term, the companies are actually probably going to lose out over like a 20-year time horizon, probably worse for them, but they don't care because in 20 years' time, the CEO is going to be well and truly retired with like 4 yachts. So he doesn't care. He doesn't care because he doesn't have to care. He doesn't have to care. That's the problem. Yeah, it's just absolutely cooked. I genuinely, I don't know what the solution is, and I've just been thinking about it a lot. It's just depressing. Honestly, it's just depressing, especially when you're like peaking in your career. I suppose I don't like that term career. I think it's very cringe, but in terms of like earnings, you're starting to peak. You're starting to really kind of know your worth in the market, and then the job market takes a dump all over the floor, and you're just kind of sat there thinking, "Wow, this sucks." So yeah, the job market in 2026, it's awful. It sucks. It's garbage. It's just garbonza beans, poo poo. Keep it real. Peace.